The world has changed. I feel it in the water. I feel it in the earth. I smell it in the air. There are all these cool new languages. Who's working in one of these languages? Who's either experimenting or doing some of your work in it? We've heard a lot about Rust at this conference, but there are all these really cool new languages, and even some of these older languages that have been around for a while are getting some like new features and new energy. All kinds of interesting stuff going on. And Ruby doesn't seem like the new cool kid on the block anymore. Ruby is sort of moving into maturity. Languages, as a rule, do not die, as Steve was telling us with the COBOL work you can still get. But like elves going into the West, Ruby will fade. I'm not sure, but I think it's entirely possible that right now is sort of the beginning of the end of the Ruby boom, as it were. I think that many of us here, if we're here because we're interested in technology, we're interested in languages, we love studying these things, we love keeping up. So I think that all of you will go on to be part of new booms and involved in new technologies. And so I think that now is perhaps a good time to take a moment to step back and think about what will we bring with us to these other communities and to these other technologies. What will be the legacy of Ruby when historians of programming languages look back and say, this is the influence that Ruby had? And while we still have some ability to affect it, maybe it's a good time to think about what should that legacy be? But I think before we talk about what the legacy of Ruby should be, it would be good to think a little bit about where Ruby's origins lie. Where did Ruby come from? And I think most of us are familiar with the facts of the matter. You know, Ruby was created by Mats in Japan on or about 1993. But I'm referring more to the spiritual origins of Ruby. Because you see, there is a conflict in progress in our industry. There is a battle going on for the hearts and the minds of programmers. In his book, Object Thinking, the author David West posits that there is a fundamental schism in software engineering between two schools of thought. On the one side, there is the formalist school, and on the other side, there is what he calls the hermeneutic school. In this talk, I will also refer to the hermeneutic school as the informal school. Formalism is part of a family of philosophies that includes rationalism and determinism and mechanism. These are philosophies that were described by people like Descartes and Hobbes and Leibniz. David West describes them this way. He says, central to this paradigm are notions of centralized control, hierarchy, and predictability, and provability. Our industry has its roots in formal thought because, we come out of a couple of very formal disciplines, the disciplines of mathematics and electrical engineering. And many of the movements that have gone through software engineering have been movements to make ours a more deterministic, a more formal discipline. David West says, as a formalist, the computer scientist expects order and logic. The goodness of a program is directly proportional to the degree to which it can be formally described and formally manipulated. Proof of correctness for a piece of software is the ultimate objective. All that is bad in software arises from deviations from these formal descriptions. Art has no place in a program. Art is nothing more than a formalism that has yet to be discovered and explicated. All right, so what is the alternative to this formalist school of thought? The alternative is the hermeneutic perspective. Now, hermeneutics is kind of a funny word. You might not have heard of it before. At its core, it refers to the study of the meanings of texts. If you've ever known any theologians, you might be familiar with this word, because theologians are, they're all about taking archaic texts in ancient languages and discovering modern meaning from those texts. But hermeneutics can also refer to a philosophical school. And it's a school that says that meaning is not some objectively pre-existing Platonic ideal that exists in the world that we discover, but that rather meaning is something that humans create in the world. It's a point of view that says that there are no unambiguous meanings in the world. Meaning always depends on the people involved. It is something that is negotiated between writer and reader, between speaker and listener. It is that mental common ground that develops between these parties. So what is the hermeneutic view of software development? This view says that the meaning of our software design is inextricably linked to the people who worked on the design. What this means is that you can't take a UML diagram and then just toss it over the wall to some coders and have them come up with the software that you envision, because the meaning of that diagram will always be tied up in the shared context and perspectives of the people who worked on it, the people who drew it. Here's David West again. The hermeneutic conception of the natural world claims a fundamental non-determinism. Hermeneuticists assert that the world is more usefully thought of as self-organizing, adaptive, and evolutionary, with emergent properties. Our understanding of the world, and hence the nature of systems we build to interact with the world, is characterized by multiple perspectives and constantly changing interpretations. Software development is neither a scientific nor an engineering task. It is an act of reality construction that is political and artistic. Wait, what? Those are some challenging notions. Those are not what we usually hear. Those are not terms that we usually hear associated with software development. What is West talking about when he refers to reality construction? Well, it turns out that a great deal of the reality that we interact with on a daily basis is, in fact, a mental construction. In order to convince you of this, I want to first start at the most basic fundamental level. Let's start with something simple, something that we depend on to tell us what is real every day. Most of us do. Something like our vision. As you are watching me, your eyes are constantly moving. Maybe they're moving between me and the screen, maybe a laptop in your lap. And these movements, the technical term for them is saccades. And they are very, very fast. Your eyes are constantly darting around. Now, you might think that since your eyes are constantly in motion like this, and since these motions are so fast, that you would be constantly seeing motion blur. But we don't. Why not? Well, as it turns out, that from the beginning of that saccade to the end, your brain suppresses the data that's coming in from your optic nerve. It just turns it off. This data's still coming in, but it just sort of turns off the feed. Well, okay. So your brain is effectively constantly editing out moments of time in your life. Okay, but if that's the case, if your brain is turning off the feed, then you might instead expect to see constant flashes of black. But we don't. Why not? Well, it turns out that not only does your brain turn off the feed, it also then goes in and edits out any evidence that it edited the feed in the first place. Basically what it does is it takes a snapshot from before or after the saccade, and it just fills in the rest with that snapshot. This is why if you ever glance over at a clock, it might seem like the first motion of the second hand was a little slow. And that's evidence of this reality editing in effect, because that's that snapshot. And this is known as the stopped clock illusion. And I explain this just to illustrate one of the many, many ways in which even our most fundamental senses, the ones that we depend on every day to tell us what is real, are not as reliable and not as objective as we like to think. Now let's bounce up to a much, much higher level of abstraction. I want you to think about a friend of yours. Someone you're close to. I want you to think about the friendship between you. How high is it? What color is your friendship? These are not questions you can answer, because that friendship is not a thing that exists in objective reality. As the Zen Buddhists might say, it is empty of independent existence. And don't get me wrong, your friendship is very real. But the reality of it it consists of a shared construction between you and your friend and the people who know you. And these shared constructions of reality, they make up the very fabric of our lives. They permeate everything we do. Here's a very popular shared construction of reality: money. You all probably know, I hope you all realize that money has no inherent value. Money has value to us because we all agree that it has value. It is a shared construction of reality. And many of the realities that we model in software, particularly the kinds of realities that we model in the kind of software that we tend to build with Ruby, like e-commerce software or enterprise software, social software, many of the realities that we model are really these shared constructions. Things like money, things like departments in a corporation. If Bob is moved from accounting to auditing, and the software is updated to reflect this fact, but Bob stays at the same desk. Nothing changes in objective reality, but everybody agrees that Bob is now in the auditing department. Things like political boundaries. When we were kids, we thought that you could tell which country you are in because some countries were green and some countries were purple and some countries were yellow. And then we grew up and we realized that that's not how it works. You look at the photos from space and none of those political boundaries are there, but these are realities that we model in our software. We record addresses and we have special cases for different addresses and for borders. But these political boundaries are something that we just agree on most of the time. I want you to join me briefly for a little conspiracy theory. I want you to imagine that secret societies that are, embedded in government are controlling the world, and they've arranged to brainwash all children in school. They have arranged so that these kids will be hypnotized to be unable to consciously see a certain word. It'll be it's like a saccade for one word. Their eyes will just sort of skip over it, and they won't consciously register it. And the word that they have been hypnotized not to be able to see is this one. I've been told some people have trouble seeing this slide, so for the sake of argument, we'll say that the word is fnord. Not only have the children been hypnotized and brainwashed not to be able to see this word, but they've also been conditioned that when their eyes fall on this word, they won't register it consciously, but they will start to become uneasy and anxious, unable to think rationally, unable to make good decisions. And then these secret societies, they arrange to scatter this word throughout public media, throughout news reports. And this is how they keep everybody sort of constantly anxious, and they keep everybody docile. This conspiracy theory is something that was dreamed up by a guy named Robert Anton Wilson, who wrote it in his novel, The Illuminatus Trilogy. And I love it because I think it's a great illustration of the way that we often do not notice the constructions that make up our reality. Now, in this book, there are people sometimes who are able to sort of wake up, break the conditioning, and this is called seeing the fnords. Here's a guy who I think saw the fnords one day. This is John Taylor Gatto. He was a renowned school teacher in New York State. In, I think, 1991, he won the New York State Teacher of the Year Award. That year, he quit. And the next year, he published an essay called The 7 Lessons School Teacher. And it's an essay about 7 lessons that every school teacher teaches to their class, whether they intend to or not, whether they are aware of it or not. They are lessons like class position. I teach that you must stay in the class to which you belong. Lessons like indifference. When the bell rings, I insist that they stop whatever it is we've been working on and proceed quickly to the next workstation. They must turn on and off like a light switch. The lesson of the bells is that no work is worth finishing, so why care too deeply about anything? And there are 5 more lessons like this. And these are lessons that go much deeper than academics. They go much deeper than whatever math or geography or history that you're studying, because they're structural. They're part of the very structure of the day and of how the education is set up. And as a result, because they're part of that structure, because they're unquestioned, they become part of the unquestioned fabric of reality for people as they grow up. They become simply the way things work. When you were a kid, did you ever have grown-ups tell you, well, that's just the way things work? Did it ever piss you off? I think that John Taylor Gatto woke up one day and saw the fnords. Over the course of my life, I've had many experiences really, of seeing fnords of my own, waking up one day and seeing something that I hadn't seen before. Here's one of the ones that's happened more recently, maybe in the past few years for me, around the concept, the idea that the tech industry, and particularly open source software, is a meritocracy. I never used to question this. It was always one of those things that was just like, well, yeah, sure, open source is a meritocracy. Obviously, it's a meritocracy. Why would you even question that? That's what makes it so great. The funny thing is, this this is honestly not even a very hard question. I mean, when I actually sat down to think about it, it took like maybe 15 minutes of concentrated thought for the whole concept to just completely fall apart. And there's been a lot written on this explaining why tech is not a meritocracy. Somebody has put together this great list of resources that you can check out if you're curious. Is meritocracy.com. But I mean, at its core, it's really pretty simple. Because the only way that open source could be a meritocracy is if you believe that white guys are somehow just magically better at programming. And that's not the case. I had my own experience of the tech industry as a white guy in the tech industry, and I extrapolated that to be an objective experience of the industry, an objective understanding of it. But as I read more and more and more and more experiences of people who are underrepresented, I realized that what I thought was objectively true was really just my own subjective experience. This is one experience that I've had of waking up and seeing the Finords. But there is no doubt in my mind that there are many, many more that I am still blind to. So reality is socially constructed. But what does this have to do with software? Well, when I learned OO, when I learned object-oriented programming, I learned it from the formalist school. And there's a good chance that you did as well. How do you know if you learned OO from a formalist? Well, did you learn about inheritance before you learned about polymorphism? If that's the case, then you probably learned from a formalist, or from the formalist school. This is Alan Kay, not a formalist. Alan Kay is the father of object-oriented programming. He created the Smalltalk language, which was intended to embody his ideas of object-oriented programming. And writing about the inception of Smalltalk, he said this. He said, "I thought of objects being like biological cells and/or individual computers on a network, only able to communicate with messages. I decided to leave out inheritance as a built-in feature until I understood it better." So this is the guy who created object-oriented programming in the language that was supposed to embody object-oriented programming. Didn't even have inheritance at first. It was an afterthought. But the formalist school emphasizes inheritance. And this is because formalism in general is greatly concerned with ontology and taxonomy of neat, comprehensive hierarchies where everything has a place and everything is in its place. This is a representation, I believe, of the Linnaean taxonomy, one of the earliest taxonomies for like plants and animals, breaking down like everything into categories. And of course, these taxonomies are not something that nature laid out. It's something that we slapped on after the fact. It's not like nature was like, okay, now freeze, you're a giraffe. And it's funny because it turns out that even if we had the ability to, like some magical scientific instrument that could actually discover exactly which animal led to which other animal and trace the entire gene inheritance tree, we still would not have an accurate picture because it turns out there's this thing called horizontal gene transfer, where genes jump from one species to another. For instance, a virus decides to edit some genes out of one animal and then it jumps to another one and edits those genes into it. There's a sea slug that takes DNA from algae and incorporates it into itself. So it turns out that even if we could trace inheritance all the way back, inheritance would still be wrong. But the formalist approach to OO says that, we're supposed to discover the single objective, unambiguous model of the domain. and then capture it in a hierarchy of classes. And unfortunately, what this means for us is that since the software model's reality, if something falls outside that model, then it doesn't exist. Recently, I visited the UK, and in order to enter the country, I had to fill out a form like this one. And among other things, it had a field for my biological sex. Because obviously, if there was some incident involving me while I was in the UK, the first thing that the authorities would need to know is what's in my pants. And this is one of many similar forms that I filled out. This one happened to be a physical form, but I think I filled out several such forms online in order to go there. And I probably filled out some of those forms in order to come here. And I have probably filled out thousands of such forms over the course of my life, and I think you probably have as well. And maybe you have also encoded fields like that into applications that you've built. There's an interesting article that came out earlier this year in the journal Nature, an article called Sex Redefined, and the subtitle kind of sums it up pretty well. It says, the idea of two sexes is simplistic. Biologists now think there is a wider spectrum than that. And it was sort of a review, an overview of a lot of the current science around biological sex. And there was some very interesting stuff in there. It turns out that depending on how you define it, they say now that as many as 1 in 100 people may have an intersex condition of some kind. You may feel yourself to be a biological male, but still have some female cells running around in you, or vice versa. And they're finding more and more that biological sex is much more of an ongoing process than something that's sort of fixed at birth, as the way they thought. The expressions change, with changing hormones and things like that, much more than they realized before. And sort of summing all this stuff up, one of the researchers that was quoted in the article, basically, I'm gonna paraphrase that. He basically said, because there isn't like one attribute that always overrides everything else, that always takes precedence for determining this, your best bet of determining if somebody is male or female scientifically is to ask them. This strict male-female dichotomy is a formalism. It's a formalism that we've all grown up with. It's a formalism that many of us probably don't even question for much of our lives. And as a result of this formalism, when somebody says to us, well, I'm honestly not sure where I fit between those two fields, or I feel like I don't fit in the one that I was assigned at birth, we say things like, oh, you're just confused. Even very smart programmers say things like this. Because that's just the way the world works, right? We all know this. Right? Well, who says? Who says that's the way the world works? Scientists are backing away from this strict dichotomy. So who says? Well, who says are these schemas, are these forms that we see over and over and over and over again throughout our lives, and it sinks into our subconscious. And we don't question it. By the way, if you want to learn more about the implicit effects of schemas and the way they can interact with your program's audience, there's this great talk by Karina Zona called Schemas for the Real World. Has anybody here seen it? Raise your hand if you haven't seen it. Okay, this is your homework. This right here. I'm going to reference a lot of other books and things, but this is your homework. Go watch this. And the problem with these formalisms, is that we begin to view the world in terms of the model and in terms of the machine. Klaus-Peter Lohr has a story about this. He says, in order to provoke a statement about the nature and limitations of algorithms, I asked the student, do you know an algorithm for consoling a crying child? To my dismay, the student began talking about actions like taking a tissue, wiping the child's cheeks, and so on. He had not grasped the essence of the question. This point of view from these embedded in these formalisms can distance us from the social effects of creating software. So on the other side, we have hermeneutics, or informalism. So what do these disciplines mean for us as software developers? Well, to get some insight into that, we can go to some of the exemplars of the informal school. People like Alan Kay, people like Rebecca Worfs-Brock, people like Kent Beck or Sandy Metz. This is Rebecca Worfs-Brock. She's one of the great object thinkers. And in her book, Object Design, she has this quote that I absolutely love. It's a little bit long, but I think it's worth it. Building an object-oriented application means inventing appropriate machinery. We represent real-world information, processes, interactions, relationships, even errors, by inventing objects that don't exist in the real world. We give life and intelligence to inanimate things. We take difficult to comprehend real-world objects and split them into simpler, more manageable software ones. Our measure of success lies in how clearly we invent a software reality that satisfies our application's requirements, and not in how closely it resembles the real world. We invent a software reality. It's not about finding that objectively true model of the world. Software becomes another venue for us to construct reality. Hopefully, a reality that empowers us to solve the problems that are in front of us. So we construct reality, and we reflect our constructions of reality down into the software that we write. But software also reflects its realities back up into the lives of real people. This is Kristen Nygaard. He was one of the co-creators of the Simula programming language. He wrote something reflecting on the experience of watching his programming language go into production use. He said, "It was evident that the Simula-based analyses were going to have a strong influence on the working conditions of employees. Job content, work intensity and rhythm, social cooperation patterns were typical examples. The impacts clearly tended to be negative." The impacts clearly tended to be negative. This is the inventor of the programming language talking about the effects of looking at the world through the lens of that programming language. Speaking of negative effects, Facebook got into some trouble recently for conducting some experiments, some surreptitious experiments on their users. They wanted to find out if they could affect people's moods based on how they filtered their timelines, what they showed and what they hid. Of course this works. Of course you can affect somebody's mood by showing them bad news or good news. The only thing that should be surprising or shocking is that people don't realize that this is what Facebook is doing each and every day. Because the thing is, we are confronted by a fire hose of information in this modern world. And in order to deal with this fire hose, we erect filters. We have to. Facebook is one of those filters. If Facebook didn't work, wasn't an effective filter, we would find something else. The problem with that is that there is no such thing as a neutral algorithm. Every decision that an algorithm makes has consequences for a user's mood and worldview. Just how subtle can these effects be? Well, here's an experiment you could try if you wanted to. Take a volunteer. Have them sit down in front of a computer and take some kind of survey. Then, when they're finished with the survey, they get up and you have them move on to another station. But on the way to the other station, they accidentally collide with someone coming the other way who's carrying a cup full of pencils. And the cup full of pencils goes flying everywhere, all over the floor. Now observe your subject and record, do they stop? Do they help pick up the pencils? How long do they spend helping pick up the pencils? Now do it again with a new subject, a new volunteer, only this time, when they sit down in front of the computer to take whatever survey it is, put a suggestion of money somewhere in the background. Maybe there's a computer in the background that's running a screensaver with dollar signs or euro signs on it. Something subtle. Same thing happens. They get up. They go on to the next station. They bump into this person who, of course, is an actor, and pencils go flying everywhere. Observe them. Do they bend down? Do they pick up? Do they help? How long do they spend helping? And then do this over and over again until you have a statistically significant sample. This is research that scientists have actually done, and what they found is that subjects who are exposed to the suggestion of money in their environment are consistently spent less time helping. And this is part of a whole family of research around this stuff. And what they've all found, the conclusion of all this research, is that people with money on their minds, even unconsciously, act more selfishly. And there are a lot of other subtle effects like this one. They call them priming effects. If you prime someone, if you get someone to read something that includes words that are related to death, not even the word death itself, but just words that are related to death, like grave. After that, they will be more likely to agree with conservative political ads. This is measurable. If you prime them with words relating to old age, like gray or wrinkled, when they get up to move on to another station, they will walk more slowly. Again, this is measurable. Now, with these subtle effects in mind, these very subtle effects that are unconscious in mind, look back at the timeline filtering and the targeted ads that Twitter and Facebook put up, and tell me that they are not modifying your reality every single day. If you want to learn more about these kinds of subtle effects, I highly recommend this book, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. What's in your hand? Chances are, these days, it's a phone. We spend a lot of our time these days looking at our phones, and our phones are one example of how software is already mediating our day-to-day reality. We start to see things sort of through the lens of our phones. And I believe that this will only increase as time goes by. Recently, Microsoft announced a technology they call HoloLens, which is like an augmented reality system where you will have Microsoft reality projected on top of physical reality. Now, I don't know if Microsoft is going to succeed with this, but I think that it's almost certain that something like this will become a part of our daily life in the not-so-far future. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure that by the time all of my kids are grown up, basically every waking hour of their lives will be mediated through software in some way. Software is going to move from a form of reality construction to the premier form of reality construction. This puts us in a uniquely powerful position because, in a way, it makes us priests or shamans of this digital reality. We become the people that put up the boundaries of these constructed realities, which is in this category and what is in that category, what action is possible and what action is not possible and what action is not even thought of. And unfortunately, as developers, we are very attracted to simplified models that explain everything. Recently, I saw some stuff making the rounds about show dogs, purebred dogs. I don't know if you know anything about this. I didn't know much about it. I went and read up about it a little bit, and it turns out that purebred dogs, the dogs that are sort of bred for showing, they're held to these really arbitrary ideals of appearance, these formal definitions of what is the breed. And of course, nature never constructed these breeds. It's just somebody at some point said, okay, that's the breed. They recorded the attributes and then said, like, to be a perfect example of this breed, you have to have all these attributes, expressed to the maximum possible amount. And unfortunately, as a result, a lot of these purebred dogs, these show dogs, have serious health conditions, just like congenital conditions. There are dogs whose brains grow to be too big for their skulls. They have dogs where the whole breed practically has hip dysplasia. They have these dogs that are unable to mate or give birth naturally. A show dog is a dog bred by a formalist. All right, but we're all hackers here. We're not interested in dog shows. We're interested in more highbrow forms of entertainment. Who here loves TED Talks? I love TED Talks. TED Talks make me feel smart. TED Talks are talks by very clever people for very clever people. And I think one of the things that's really attractive about them is that often the narrative of a TED Talk is someone who is very clever, who discovered a system of the world that somebody else hadn't, or a system of one part of the world. And then, they discovered a way that they could just pull some lever that nobody else had found and fix something. They could hack it. This is Sir Francis Galton. Sir Francis Galton was an interesting fellow. He was a progressive of his time. He was a sociologist, an early sociologist. He was a psychologist. He was an anthropologist. He was an explorer, a geographer, an inventor, a meteorologist. He created the concept of statistical correlation, and he published over 340 books and papers. I think Sir Francis Galton would have been a great TED talker. Unfortunately, he missed his opportunity by about 100 years. Sir Francis Galton was also the creator of eugenics. Now, for anyone who is not familiar with eugenics or needs a refresher, eugenics was a movement at the beginning of the 20th century that was all about improving the human race through measures like segregation, birth control, marriage restrictions, compulsory sterilization, forced abortions, and other unsavory things. And this was not some fringe movement, okay? This is something that was embraced all over the world by progressive countries. It was something that was embraced by by very clever, very progressive people of those times, the founders and hackers of their day. And in the Nuremberg war trials, the Nazi scientists used eugenics as a defense, saying what we were doing is no different from what all of you were doing. Francis Galton and many of the people who embraced eugenics were obviously very clever people. They were very smart people. They were people who wanted to make the world better. And I think this is one illustration of the fact that being clever is no protection from a failure to question the way things are. And in fact, I think that being clever can actually make us more susceptible, because we tend to think that we are rational. We tend to think that we are objective. We tend to think that we have questioned all of the premises that need questioning. Dave Pell wrote this a few days ago. He was discussing the question, are we in a new tech bubble? And he said, yes, we're in a bubble, but it's not a tech bubble, it's a psychological bubble. The psychological bubble makes you think that because you can code a photo app or design an algorithm to get me to the airport a little quicker, that also qualifies you as an expert on every other topic. Now, here would be a good place for me to give you some examples of very clever people making stupid oversights or something like that, but I think that sort of misses the point, because it's very easy to point and laugh at other people. It's a lot harder to ask yourself, what are the premises that I am failing to question? So reality is socially constructed, and we reflect our constructions of reality down into the software that we build. And that software then goes and reflects those realities back up into the lives of people. But what does this mean for us? What this means is that we cannot pretend that our philosophy as programmers is disconnected from the impact that our software has on the world. When we write code, we shape the world. And for decades, the dominant philosophy in our industry has been a formalist and command and control philosophy, a hubristic paradigm that says that we can know objective reality and model it in software. All right, so where do we come in? Where does this community come in? What does this have to do with our legacy as a Ruby community? Well, I really think that Ruby, maybe along with JavaScript, is the heir to the informalist, the hermeneutic school of thought. Because in a way, it was almost an end run around the formalist school, because we had all these very formalist influenced languages and movements. And then along comes Ruby with its small-talky, lispy soul wrapped up in an unthreatening C-ish, Java-ish syntax. I think that Ruby is technically a very informal language. Things like constants and core classes are really just suggestions. There's always more than one way to do something. You can always modify pretty much any part of the language that you want to. I think that the Ruby community, more than most others, is steeped in informalist, in agile practices. The original conception of agile was very much an informalist movement, and that has, I think, really influenced a lot of our community. We're a community that really seems to value conversation and consensus over top-down architecture. And as a community, we value community. That's why we're here. That's why there are so many Ruby conferences. I think as a community, more than just about any other technical community I know of, we really value getting together as people and relating to other people. I think there's a good case to be made that Ruby is more than any other a community of amateurs in many different ways. And that's a good thing, not a bad thing. And we're also a bit silly. And that's a good thing too. And while I regret to get serious about being silly, I really think that this is important. This is essential, because in the position we're in, with the responsibility that we're talking about, we cannot afford to take ourselves too seriously. So in a programming world that pays lip service to OO ideas while still teaching formalist methods, Ruby has been, in many ways, a stubborn island of informalism. When I look at the way that our industry talks about itself, I see a kind of cult forming, a cult of cleverness. It's a cult that says you are hackers, you are makers, you are disruptors, you are world changers. And I believe this. I believe you will change the world. After all, when we write code, we shape the world. But I don't believe that it's just necessarily going to be a better world. I don't believe that this is something to get all excited about. I don't think it's something to get all psyched up about, at the next corporate-sponsored hackathon. In fact, I hope that you are terrified. I hope that you are humbled by this realization, because this is an enormous responsibility. And we know from history that efforts to shape reality based on mechanistic, oversimplified models have a history of unintended consequences. And as programmers, we love our simplified models. Now, I'd like to tell you that now that I've told you all this, now that you're aware of this, you can predict the effects that your preconceptions and that your worldviews will have on people as you put that into your software. But the truth is, very often, you will only find out after the fact. You will only find out after the fact what the real effects were of the worldviews, the realities that you encoded into your software, like Kristen Nygaard with his Simula programming language. And we can't stop doing this either. We can't just stop encoding our realities. We can't stop encoding our philosophies and our worldviews into our code. That's not the way this works. All we can do is be aware that this is going on. Be mindful that this is happening. Confess in your hearts daily that you are committing acts of reality construction. This means we have no more illusions. We can no longer hide behind the fig leaf that what we are doing is just modeling the way things are. All we can do is to be mindful of the values that we hold, the worldviews that we hold as we are creating software. And that's the opportunity here. That's the ray of light. Because we have the potential here, we have the opportunity here to help construct a reality that is more affirming and welcoming. We have that power. We have an opportunity to help construct a reality that respects human dignity, maximizes choice. A reality that acknowledges messy, pluralistic human family. A more humane reality. And this is a challenging task. It's challenging because it's not a matter of picking the right tools or choosing the right development process or using the right design patterns. Because if we accept that we reflect our values into code, whether we want to or not, whether we realize it or not, then we can't look into the monitor in order to fix this. We have to look into the mirror. If we can be mindful of the values that we reflect into our code, if we can approach our craft with humility and an understanding of our limitations, if we can admit that cleverness is no substitute for compassion, if we can acknowledge that we always have a perspective, and it's only one of many perspectives. Stop saying that there is my view of the problem and your view of the problem, and then there is the real objective view of the problem. There's just my view of the problem and your view of the problem. That's all we get. That's all we get to work with. If we can approach our designs as a conversation rather than as a declaration, if we can embrace ambiguity, if we can bring these human values to our code, then I think we stand a chance of bringing soul to software and of being the soul of our industry. And that is what I hope the legacy of the Ruby community will be. Thank you very much.